Some of you might like to know why I am not a Christian. Apparently, the Indian secularist press writes that I hate Christians as well as Muslims. That has nothing to do with it. As you will hear from my story, there is absolutely no ground for hate. I was born in a Catholic family. My parents were very devout Catholics. I was, of course, baptized. I don't know if outsiders mean what baptism is. You know, well, in some sects you actually have to plunge into the water, but in many others it is enough to just have some water thrown over you, and on that occasion you get your Christian name. And effectively it means that I go to heaven and you do not. So people who are baptized, they are saved, and people who are not, they are doomed. So I am saved and most of you are doomed. And then the whole thing started. I went to a Catholic kindergarten, a Catholic primary school, a Catholic secondary school, and then a Catholic university. I've been through the whole Catholic curriculum. Then in preparation for our solemn communion, which is a sacrament you take at about age 12. For several years we had intensive courses in Catholic religion in our parish, that is the community around one church. So, and in those days this was still pretty serious. You see, when I see nowadays kids who have been through a nominally Catholic school, they don't know anything. Also because the only thing they get is what they get in religion classes in school. They don't go to church anymore. We learned all the lectures from the Old Testament, from the letters of St. Paul, and from the Gospel every week in church. You see, that has practically disappeared. So I pretty much know what it is all about. Oh yes, and 1 or 2 years before I went to school, they abolished the obligatory catechism. You know, you had to learn the teachings of the church, you know, that had been compiled. It was not part of the gospel or something. It was church teaching based on the gospel, but only very partly. And people used to learn that by heart. So for my generation, that had already been abolished. But being a curious young fellow, I read the whole thing on my own. And I took it rather seriously. Like I really believed that unbelievers went to hell, but also that believers, if they don't behave well, they also go to hell. So that's of course told to children to keep them in check. And so many people believe it. And they say to one another when they confess having done something wrong, something sinful, you will go to hell. So I took that quite serious. I went to confession, confess my sins and so on, till age 14, 15. That's when I stopped believing all this. And this was not due to some particular event or development. You see, some people really feel very vengeful against the church, either because they have been sexually abused. I mean, even now it is a lot in the news, in the Vatican, in Ireland, in Boston, everywhere. and even in South India. So there are cases like this, or you have priests who force their parishioners to have sex with them, or nuns, or so I mean, there are all kinds of sex scandals. They also exist in other religions, let that be clear. Hindu gurus in America also often come in the news for the wrong reasons. And Pakistani madrasa teachers misbehave with their beardless boys, and all these things happen. So it's not typical for the Catholic Church, but nevertheless it happens a lot. And so if it happens close to you, you tend to lose your confidence in the clerics. Now, that didn't happen to me or anywhere around me. So that didn't play at all. Also, many people in the old days felt very frustrated because of their Catholic upbringing, very repressed sexually especially, and very burdened with guilt, with all kinds of moral complications. And that too didn't really play, not much at least, not seriously. No, you see, the only reason was that I understood that actually, as a grown-up, you can't believe these things. You see, that Adam and Eve incurred hereditary sin is already a strange story, because mortality was the consequence of sin, whereas we know that all animals are mortal. You see men descending from apes. Okay, apes are mortal too, even though they haven't sinned the way humans do. So then the story that Jesus delivered us from sin. You see, in 33, when Jesus was crucified, there was no appreciable increase or decrease in the sinfulness of mankind. Nothing special happened. In fact, it is not even sure that Jesus himself conquered mortality. For all we know, he disappeared. And the gospel writers spirited him away, or at least the Acts of the Apostles writers spirited him away through the ascension. So he just, after 40 days of the resurrection, he just went up to heaven, and he disappeared just like all people who die. So again, it's not a very credible story. And then the idea that he's going to come back at the end of times, well, maybe not, and it's indeed very improbable when you read in the Gospel that several times he himself makes the prediction that some of the people in the audience will still be alive when I have my second coming. Now, that generation came and went, the next generation came and went, and now we are 2,000 years on, and still he hasn't come back. So that's strange. And we are familiar with these doomsday prophets who announce the end of the world. You see, it was announced by the Jehovah's Witnesses for 1914, which was a bit of a disaster year, but nevertheless not the end of the world. It was announced for 1975 and so on. And so these doomsdays have a way of not coming. Now, in their case, you can say, well, it's hard to predict something that is going to happen, something that is going to overcome you. But in the case of Jesus, it's not so difficult. He is not predicting someone else coming back. He is predicting his own second coming. So all he had to do was to take his agenda and look up, hey, when is this that I'm coming back? And then, he could have said that. And even then he failed. So that's not a good advertisement. So once you start reading the Bible a bit critically, it doesn't hold up. Now, we are now talking about the 1970s. In fact, the mentality that underlay this development was created in the 60s. This was a very optimistic period. You should have lived through it. It was an age of enormous progress, also of enormous prosperity. You see, after the Second World War, in Western Europe, you had the so-called Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. Years of constant progress, of increasing prosperity. And that was backed up by a great scientific progress and very visible. Like you had these villages that were all provided with electricity. More and more people had cars, had TV and so on. So you just palpably saw and felt this increasing presence of modern technology. Then there was space travel. In 1969, the first landing on the moon. I remember I saw it on TV at 4 o'clock at night. And my mother came to wake me up to watch. And so you see, that gave an enormous feeling of progress. So, we can do it. And therefore we don't need this this consolation of the faith. And so that is mainly what did it, you see, the feeling of outgrowing this quaint superstition. There was a democratization of knowledge. So there had been free thinkers and unbelievers since the 18th century, mostly rich, well-educated people, often with a division of labor within the family. Like the husband would be with the Freemasons and would be a religious skeptic, but he made sure that his wife was a devout Catholic, because that way she will not cheat on me, and they made sure that their servants were devout Catholics. That way they won't steal from me. But you see, this was only an elite circle, but after the Second World War, it was democratized. And so it caught on. And what played next was the factor of conformism. Many people had gone to church simply because everybody went. And they didn't ask questions about it. That was just what everybody did. Now, when more and more people started staying away from church, then people started feeling doubtful and doubting themselves. And so more and more people started staying away. The same people who had gone to church because everybody went, then started staying away because everybody was staying away. So this was a general movement, and you see in many families, it often is the eldest son, like myself, who was the first to question their own adherence to Catholicism, and then the others followed suit. At the end, also the parents. Now, in my case, not the parents. My father was a devout Catholic till the end. My mother is still alive, also still a Catholic, but nevertheless, many old people who still go to church, who still want to be part of the Catholic community because they have always been, nevertheless say that, oh my God, in our childhood, how did they fool us? What silly things they made us believe. So you see, they too have essentially outgrown the faith. And so that's a very general phenomenon. So it also happened to me. Now, when I outgrew the Catholicism, another ideology was practically waiting for me. At that time, there was a lot of leftism, Karl Marx, not that we went very far, but the Communist Manifesto is an easy book, there were demonstrations against the American nuclear missiles and stuff like that. And so I was part of that movement. And so in the background, it also helped to really consolidate this break with religion. Then the next years, I moved to, the soft left. You see, very many people became non-political, but to the extent that they were political, they took for granted that it was leftist politics. And so that evolved towards like the Green movement and the New Age movement. And so I worked in a New Age bookstore from, intermittently between 19 and 26 years of age. And I knew those circles very well. And so there you saw a certain revival of belief in Jesus. Only he had a very different status, one which real Christians would never accept. You see, Jesus was seen as some kind of a guru, some kind of a spiritual teacher. And then it was also said that the church has misunderstood him or has misused him. Churchianity, as Swami Vivekananda called it. That's a fairly flaky understanding of what happened. There is no sign at all that Jesus' ideas were so different from those of his followers. And there is no reason to assume that Jesus knew it all better. Nevertheless, it is clear that Jesus was some kind of a traveling healer, exorcist. He was, of course, very superstitious, thinking that diseases are the consequence of ghost possession. So he tried to drive out ghosts. So in medical terms, it's not much. But okay, you see, once in a while he may have had success. And so he started to get a very big idea of himself, namely that he was the Messiah announced in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And you see, to that, this shouldn't be taken serious. Nevertheless, he also gave some sermons where he borrowed from whatever was in the air in terms of spiritual lore, much of it identifiable as coming straight from Buddhism. And so there is in fact a theory that says, actually, the teachings of Jesus are nothing but a Middle Eastern form of Buddhism. I think that is exaggerated, but nevertheless, it is true that a lot of Buddhist ideas are taken over by him. And it's mainly precisely those things that make him sympathetic. You see, the idea that the law is not important. What is important is your feelings, your feeling of charity for your fellow man. That is important. And if that makes you break any ritual taboo, well, so be it. You see, this charity is far more important than any ritual rules. So that is what made people like Jesus. He was a bit anti-authoritarian, which at that time was all the rage. You see, you didn't want any father in heaven telling you what to do. And so Jesus, in a way, seemed to be saying just that. So that was with the spirit of the times, but that was less and less Christian. Not Christian the way any of the churches understand it. And so there are very many Hindus who see Jesus the same way. Jesus as some kind of a guru and so on. Yeah, that's all nice, but that's not Christian. Not at all. Christianity implies that Jesus is the truth, the way, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through him. So if you say that he was just one spiritual teacher among many, then that is definitely offensive to real Christians. So, and nevertheless, I think that you can't hold anything against Christianity except that it's a mistake. And so people make mistakes, it's no big deal. Only by now, you see, the knowledge is easily obtainable that allows you to outgrow these illusions. So that's all that has to be done with Christianity. Just leave it behind. Take a critical look at how it came about. There are good things in it that you may retain, but the doctrine that defines Christianity, that I think cannot be saved. Thank you.